Hi, this is Michelle Duma from the Department of Education, Schools Division, Quezon Province, Philippines. Today, I'm going to share with you a topic on assessment of student learning. This is one of the crucial areas in education that educators like us should learn so that we would be able to contribute to the learning progress of our students in school. Now, assessment, as we all know, is a broad topic in education. So what are we going to expect from this presentation? So we will be guided with the following objectives. So first is to define what is assessment in relation to student learning. Second, identify the goal of assessment in relation to student learning. Explain the approaches and guidelines in assessing student learning. And also discuss the types of assessment in relation to student learning. And lastly, is to differentiate traditional from authentic assessment. Now, these objectives would serve as our guide as we go along with the presentation. Now, let's talk about what you mean by assessment. So it says here, assessment is the process of gathering evidence of students' performance over a period of time to determine learning and mastery of skills. That is why, based on the definition given to assessment, this is really considered as an integral part of the teaching and learning process. Can you imagine after an instructional delivery without providing assessment to students? Do you think you would be able to determine the progress of the students after an instructional delivery? I think that would not be possible. That's why the very essence of providing assessment to students is for us to determine how our students progress in a certain level. If they already acquire certain knowledge based on the target learning outcomes or based on the lesson objectives that the teacher set in a particular instruction or lesson. Now, let's take it one by one. Based on the definition, it says here, this is a process. So meaning to say, it consists of certain steps, gathering evidence of students' performance. So it means to say that this is about collection of pertinent documents, pertinent information about how the students learned, how the students progressed over a period of time. So meaning to say, when we conduct an assessment, this is not just a one-shot activity. Okay? Now, when you do an assessment, it should be over a period of time. It must not be a one-shot activity because the collection of pertinent information that would measure the performance of your student should be in a period, a certain over a period of time. So it's a series of activities. It's a series of learning tasks and activities that the students went through in a particular lesson or unit or chapters. So after providing them a certain topic. Okay, and the very essence also of providing assessment is for them to determine the learning and mastery of skills. Now, that is why assessment, as I have said a while ago, this is a really an integral part of teaching and learning because without assessment, we would not be able to see the level of progress of our learners. So that is why it is very important that after a certain instructional delivery or during the instructional delivery, the teachers would be able to assess how the students perform. The teacher would also have to validate whether the students are really learning during the instructional delivery. Okay? And it also says here that there is some evidence that the teachers may consider in the collection of data with regards to the students' performance. So it may be in the form of journals. So journals are really also important source of evidences of students' performance because using journal, the students would be able to narrate and make reflections on the learning that they had in a particular instructional delivery of the teachers. Okay, and the students would be able to write the certain learning experiences that they went through in a particular session, classroom instruction, either it's online or not online. So through journals, the students would be able to reflect and would provide them a lot of opportunities to share their feelings about a certain lesson. Okay, next evidence of learning that may be considered in doing the assessment is written work, which is very common, maybe in the form of a practical exercises, which is very common. After giving an instructional delivery, you will be asked your students, okay, answer this. So something like that. It's also one of the evidences that you may also consider when you are doing an assessment. Another evidence of learning is the use of portfolio, which is also very common that you ask your students to prepare after a certain period of time. This is about compilation of all the learning outputs of the students. When you ask your students, okay, compile all the learning outputs that you have, and then that would also summarize their learning performance. And the students would be able also to make reflections of the learning activities and learning experiences that they had in a particular topic or subject. So using that portfolio. Okay, and then next is the test. The provision of tests is very common in all methods of doing assessment of students' performance. Because in tests, you'd be able to know the knowledge of the students, okay, the level of the knowledge that they had after a certain instructional delivery. Okay, because there you would be able to test whether they would be able to recall important concepts, important terms, and details of the topics that you have shared during the instructional delivery. And then next is the other learning tasks, which the teachers may also consider in assessing the students' performance, because the provision of learning activities is also very common in assessing or measuring how the learners progress from a certain topic. Okay, now these are the evidences, few. Okay, these are just our few evidences of learning that you may consider in the provision of assessment for you to be able to determine the learning of the students and how they would be able to apply the knowledge that they have acquired. Now let's talk about the goal of assessment. So the primary objective of assessing the student is, of course, to improve the student learning, because after the collection of certain data about the progress of the students, you would be able to determine certain interventions so that you'd be able to improve the performance of the students in a particular topic when you see, for example, gaps in the learning of the students, in the knowledge or the mastery skills of the students. So that's why after assessing, you would be able to collect the information, and that information that would serve as your reference in doing or providing the students scaffolding or certain interventions that they may apply in learning a certain topic. And of course, it also aims to provide students, parents, and teachers with reliable information regarding student progress. Of course, by doing an assessment, you are going to provide the students, the parents, and of course the teachers the reliable or valid source of information about the knowledge, about the mastery of skills of the students that they have acquired after provision of lessons. That's why the goal of assessment is also to provide students, parents, and teachers with reliable information about the student progress. And of course, and the extent of attainment of the expected learning outcomes. Because after assessing the learning of the students, you would be able to determine the learning outcomes being achieved after instructional delivery. Were you able to attain the goals that you have set after a certain topic is given to the student? So those are the things that you are considering after the assessment, after getting the relevant information about the progress of the students. We also have what you call the approaches to assessment. These approaches to assessment describe the main roles or the functions of providing assessment to student learning. The first is assessment for learning. Then second is assessment as learning. Third is assessment of learning. Now, these are considered as the approaches to assessment. Now, let's differentiate these three. So what do you mean by assessment for learning? What do you mean by assessment as learning and assessment of learning? Because these three approaches will provide us different perspectives about the main role or the crucial functions of doing an assessment. Okay, now for the assessment for learning. So assessments are integrated with instruction. So as I've said a while ago, assessment should be an integral part of teaching and learning. It should not be isolated area. When you are delivering the instruction, of course, after you taught the students, you must assess the progress of the students. Okay, because that is the only time that you would be able to measure how well you delivered the lesson, and how will the students perform after you deliver the certain instruction. That's why the really essence of assessment is for learning. Okay, that's why it says here assessment for learning, because this is integrated with instruction. And of course, to help teachers monitor students' progress, because as I am again and again telling you that the essence of providing assessment is really to see how the students progress in a particular topic, and also to identify their learning needs, because when you are doing an assessment you would be able to determine the strength and the weaknesses, the learning gaps of the students. And after seeing that the students have their learning gaps in a particular lesson, then you'd be able to see to provide them certain learning interventions or activities that would be able to help them cope with the learning needs that they encounter during the instruction. And of course, to adjust their instruction accordingly. So after knowing that, yeah, really, there are needs that should be considered and should be given to the students during the learning process. Because after the assessment, for example, you have noticed that this particular group of students are really challenged with this particular topics. They find this particular content very difficult. And that would also give you a certain reflection. You would be able to gain pertinent information about doing self-reflection, because you may ask yourself that what happened? Is there a problem about my instructional delivery? Are my teaching approaches okay to this particular group of students? So that's why doing an assessment would really give you information, pertinent information about adjusting the type of instruction, I mean the approaches that you have in delivering the instruction. So that's why one of the crucial functions of assessing the students is for learning. And the next one is about the assessment of learning. So what do you mean by assessment of learning? So assessment gives a picture of what the students have actually learned after instruction. Okay, because after the assessment, you'd be able to provide the students, the parents, and even teachers pertinent information about the learning progress of the students. That's why it says here, it gives a picture of what the students have actually learned. And the students would be able to be informed about how they perform in the class, about the learning progress that they have in a particular topic. And of course, providing evidence of learning and certifying competency, because using the means of verifications, using the evidences that you have collected through the assessment that you have provided to your students, you'd be able to see the learning activities that went through by the students in a particular topic or lesson in the classroom. And that would also give you important evidence of learning and certifying their competency level, where competency level the students are already after you have provided your instruction. And of course, we have the assessment as learning, okay? Because the first one is assessment for learning, because the purpose of assessment is for them to improve learning, of course. And the second one that I have presented to you is about assessment of learning, which would give the students pertinent information about what they have really accomplished after a certain instruction, or what is their learning progress after that. So this time is assessment as learning. So this is associated with self-assessment, where students set their targets. When you ask your students, all right, so make a self-assessment about your own performance. Now, your students will be able to set their own targets. This is the beauty of doing assessment as learning. This is the beauty of providing your students the opportunity to assess themselves. And of course, by doing this, they can actively monitor and evaluate their own learning in relation to their set targets. Because when you ask your students to assess themselves about a particular topic, okay, how they progress already after that, now they would be able to really see, okay, and evaluate themselves. What progress level am I already after this particular topic? So that's the very essence and the beauty of doing the self-assessment, or asking the students to assess themselves. Thus, they are learning at the same time by becoming self-directed or independent learners. So by asking your students to do a self-assessment, they would have the development of self-directions. They would have that opportunity to become independent learners because they are the ones who are setting their targets. They are the ones setting their learning outcomes that they have to achieve after a certain instructional delivery. So that's the beauty of assessment as learning. Now, this summarizes the three approaches to assessment, which is, again, may I recall, the first is assessment for learning, assessment of learning, and assessment as learning. All right, now for us to be able to assess effectively the student learning, we have to be guided with the following principles of good practice in assessing learning outcomes. So first, the assessment of student learning starts with the institution's vision, mission, and core values. Now, when we provide assessment, you have to consider that the kind of assessment that you are doing to your students are rooted on the institution's vision. It's rooted on the aims of the institution itself, their mission also, and as well as on the core values that they're expecting to develop from their students, so that you would be able to see whether the kind of education that you are providing, the kind of learning that you are providing to your students are really suited, they are relevant in the development or in the achievement of the institutional vision, mission, as well as on the core values. And the second principle that you really have to consider as a good practice in the provision of assessment to student learning is it should require attention not only to the outcomes, but also and equally to the activities and experiences that lead to the attainment of learning outcomes. So you have to bear in mind that when you are providing assessment to your students, you should not only focus on the end result. Okay? Now, you also have to consider how these outputs were delivered by the students. What are the learning activities done by students or underwent by the students prior to the attainment of this learning outcomes? Because they're more important than the end result. Because the process of learning and the process of attaining certain learning outcomes is really important in developing the progress of the learners in a particular lesson or topic. That's why in the provision of assessment, it should not only focus on the learning outcomes, but of course on the activities and experiences that experienced by the learners in the attainment of such outcomes. Assessment works best. You have to bear in mind when you are providing assessment to your student that assessment works best when it is continuous, ongoing, and not episodic. Now, when you are considering assessing your students' learning, it must be a series of learning activities, a series of learning practice. It's not just a one-shot activity that you are doing. So it should not be episodic. Like for example, there are so many lessons that you already discussed in a particular unit or chapters, and then that's the only time that you will assess the learning progress or the learning outcomes of the students. So it's a no-no for providing assessment to student learning. So if you want to really effectively see and determine whether the students are progressing in that particular topic, then your assessment should be continuous and ongoing. And aside from that, the other example of this principle is that when you are doing an assessment, you should not stop there in one area. Okay, you should provide a follow-up learning assessment to your students so that you will be able to confirm the reliability of the information that you obtained from a certain assessment that you have provided to your students. So that's the idea of why is it that assessment should be continuous and ongoing and it should not be episodic. Another principles that you have also to consider when assessing learning outcomes is that you have to begin the assessment by specifying clearly and exactly what you want to assess. It's very, very important when you are providing the learners an assessment. Why? Because if you do not know what is your target about providing assessment, then you would not be able to give justice on the main purpose of doing the assessment. That's why you have to set clear targets. You have to set your objectives. Why are you doing the assessment? What are you going to assess? So something like that. So those are the things you have to bear in mind when you're providing an assessment. Okay? Now, next is the learning outcome or the lesson objective. Not the content is the basis of the assessment task. In other words, when you are considering assessment task, now you are not going to consider the content itself, but the learning outcome or the lesson objective. You have to base the assessment that you are providing to your students to the learning outcomes or the lessons objectives that you set. Okay, prior to the instructional delivery, not on the content itself, because yeah, the content is very important in instructional delivery, but that should not be your reference in providing the assessment task, because you must align the provision of the assessment task to the set learning outcome or the objectives of the lessons that you have. All right, now the next is you have to set your criterion of success or acceptable standard of success. Now, when you are assessing, of course, the performance of the students, you really have to set your standard. You really have to set the acceptable level of success of a particular student. For example, okay, is 7 an acceptable standard of the performance of the student? If the total item of the exam, for example, is 10, 7 over 10 pass the success or acceptable standard of performance success or the learning success of the student. The point there is you have to really set your criterion. So what is your criterion in determining whether your students pass a certain lesson? What is your success indicator that would determine that the students really progress from a certain topic? So you really have to consider this one. Make use of varied tools for assessment, data gathering, and multiple sources of assessment. As teachers, you should not only use one kind of tool, not just one instrument for assessing the student's performance, because maybe the result of one assessment instrument would not be valid or would not give you valid and reliable evidence of the student's performance. That is why it's very important that you have to use various tools when you are doing or when you are collecting evidence of students' performance. And as I have presented to you a while ago, you may consider that asking your students to prepare journals. You may ask the students to answer the test. You may ask the students to submit a certain project or portfolio, so something like that. So you have to consider varied or different types of instruments in gathering data about the performance of the students. You have to consider multiple sources of assessment so that you'll be able to come up with reliable or valid results. Okay, so next is that learners must be given specific feedback about their performance. So this is also another beauty of doing the assessment, because you would be able to give feedback about the performance of the students, and that should be part of the good practice that you have to consider when you are doing an assessment to student learning or on the learning outcomes of the students. Provision of feedback is very, very essential to improve the performance of the learners, because you cannot expect them to improve a lot when you fail to give them feedback or information about their performance. Regular and specific feedback. For example, okay, you perform well in this particular area. Okay, very good. So that's nice. It's a good thing that teachers would praise the students, but they are not specific. Yeah, they would really boost the motivation of the students to perform better in a certain lesson or subject, but it would not allow the students to address specific learning needs or the learning gaps, which are, for example, see by the teacher during the instructional delivery. That's why you have to be very specific when you are providing feedback on the performance of the students. For example, all right, you did it well. However, you really have to improve your writing skills on this particular topic, because and so on. So something like that. You really have to consider the provision of specific feedback that would be relevant to students on how they would further improve okay, their performance in terms of the areas that you have presented on the students during the instructional delivery. Okay, that's really the essence of why students are really of crucial help to students in terms of improving their performance. Okay, now next is that assessment should be on real world application and not on out of context drills. For your students to be able to see the relevance of the assessment that you are conducting, okay, on their performance, you should allow the opportunity that you provided students assessment wherein they can use that in a real world context, wherein they would really see the relevance of conducting that, wherein they would really see that they would be able to apply that in a real setting, in a real community activities. It's one good practice that you really have to consider when you are providing, or assessing how the performance goes from a certain or throughout the instructional delivery. Okay, now next is to emphasize on the assessment higher order thinking. It's not just when you are doing the assessment, be considerate on those learners who are really fast in the classroom. Because as we all know, learners are learning differently. Learners have different learning styles. They also have their own multiple intelligences. Okay, that's why aside from the fact that you will be able to give them tests on testing their knowledge, their capacity to recap certain information, so why not give them also or emphasize on the assessment higher order thinking skills, wherein they would be able to think deeper and they would be able to apply really the learnings or the information that they obtained after a certain instruction. Okay, from that essence, when you are providing, for example, experiential learning activities to your students, they would be able to develop higher order thinking skills. And that's also one thing that you have to consider when you are assessing them. Now, next is, this is also another important practice that teachers should consider when providing assessment. So provide the students opportunities for self-assessment. As I have explained a while ago, when you are allowing your students to do self-assessment, they would be able to monitor and evaluate their own performance. They would be able to set their own targets. And when they set their own targets, they are really accountable of their own learning. They would really strive to achieve those learning objectives. They would really work harder to fulfill the targets that they have set prior to the learning instruction. So those are the benefits or advantages of asking the students to assess themselves. And of course, they are the ones who will see their limitations. They would be the ones to address their own learning gaps, of course, with the scaffolding of the teachers. Okay, now we have also two types of assessment. It is classified as formative and summative, which is very common. When we talked about the formative assessment, so it says here it monitors student learning to provide ongoing feedback to improve teachers' instructional delivery and students' learning. Now, I highlighted the words monitors student learning because when you are doing formative assessment, from the word form, you are forming the students' learning. Now, you really have to ensure effective monitoring of learning throughout the instructional delivery. And the aim of providing formative assessment is to provide ongoing feedback, okay, on how you would be able to improve your instructional delivery as teachers in the classroom, and how would you able to improve the students' learning by giving them immediate feedback. That's why one of the principles in providing assessment is you have to provide specific feedback to your students, because by not doing so, you fail the crucial role or the main function of providing assessment to your students. And of course, when you are doing formative assessment, this is an immediate response of the teachers on how they would really address the learning gaps or the learning needs of the students throughout the instructional delivery. And okay, specifically, formative assessment helps students identify the strengths and weaknesses. And that's the beauty of doing the formative assessment, because By providing ongoing feedback, they would be able to see what's my strength. Okay, what are my own weaknesses? And this can be done by asking the students to do self-assessment, because when you ask the students, they would be the ones to assess themselves and they would find their strengths and weaknesses about a certain topic. It will inform teachers where students are struggling and address problems immediately. So formative assessment is not just informing the students on how they can improve their performance in a certain lesson or subject. Also give pertinent information about the teacher's teaching strategies, the appropriate or relevant strategies or approaches when doing the instructional delivery. Because somewhat, when you do the formative assessment, the teachers themselves would be able also to make their own reflection about their own teaching styles, about their own teaching strategies to effectively deliver the lesson to the students. Okay, so that's the crucial function of providing formative assessment. And of course, okay, it also says here that formative assessment estimates students' level of achievement in order to enhance student learning during the learning process. Because in the formative assessment, this is a continuous or ongoing feedback, as I have explained to you a while ago. This is a continuous provision of feedback. This is a continuous monitoring of the student's progress. That's why it says here it is done during the learning process. Okay, as you deliver the lesson, you check the student's knowledge. Okay, for example, you said to your students, this is our topic, so can you recall our previous topic, something like this. So that's why you are doing there already a formative assessment. And then at the middle of your instruction, you check the students whether they are really they really understand the topic that you are telling to them. And of course, after also the lesson is presented, you may also check whether they have clarifications or questions about the topic. So this is the essence of doing the formative assessment. And of course, it allows students to practice skills or test knowledge without the pressures associated with grades, because the very purpose of formative assessment is to form, okay, to form the students, to monitor the progress of the students. So it will not pressure the students with the provision of high grades. It would not give so much burden on the students during the learning process, because they would not feel that I am really pressured that I will have low grade. Okay, it's not the purpose of the formative assessment. That's why sometimes this is also known as the low stake assessment. Okay, in measuring the student's progress in a particular topic or lesson. And of course, it takes the form of informal. Okay, these are some of the examples that teachers may consider in doing the formative assessment. So it may take the form of informal or quick questions. Okay, just like what I have told you a while ago, you may just simply ask the student, can you still recall the topics that I have discussed to you or I have shared to you last meeting? Okay, what can you say about our topic? So something like that. So those are some informal or quick questions that you may provide your students just to check their knowledge, just to check the learning progress of the students, and just also to monitor whether they are really there. The presence of learning is there inside the classroom, okay, when you are delivering the instructions. This is very important, okay? But of course, the teacher should be wise in doing the oral questioning and providing informal or quick questions. The teachers must be creative enough in asking questions to students to provoke their thinking, to provoke learning from the students. And of course, another form is the low-stake quizzes. It means to say that you will only assign a low point value in grading the quizzes of the students in terms of doing the formative assessment, because your purpose there is not really to pressure the students with the grades, but of course to help them really improve and to see their weaknesses, okay, and to see the learning gaps of the students. Next is the 1-minute paper and pencil test. And that can also be possible to be provided to students, because when you're providing them. For example, okay, you ask your students, okay, within 60 seconds, you write on a sheet of paper, you're learning about this particular topic. And from that point of view, you as teachers would be able to test whether your students really learn from the topic. And you would really you can check as early as possible the learning progress of the students, because you would be able to determine their learning experiences and the kind of learning that they went through after the instructional delivery through that particular activity. And another form of formative assessment that you may consider is the practice exercises. These are very common in the classroom instructional delivery, because after a certain topic, usually the teachers are providing the students specific exercises wherein you'll be asking your students, okay, answer these in a sheet of paper, and then you'll be asking them to self-assess themselves. And from that point also, the students will be able to reflect on the scores that they have obtained after the assessment, whether they pass or they fail. If they failed, they would be able to determine their own weaknesses, okay, through that practice exercises. And of course, you would be able to scaffold the students so that you can bridge the learning gaps that they have encountered during the instructional delivery. Now, another type of assessment is what you call the summative assessment. Now, we're done with the discussion about the formative assessment. Let's see, how is it different from formative assessment? It says here that summative assessment produces a measure that sums up. Okay, the key word here is sums up student learning, because from the word summative assessment, summation, it means to say that this kind of assessment is provided at the end of a certain instructional unit. Okay, after summing up all the the lessons you have provided to your students. Okay, so that's why it's really different to the formative assessment, because this time we'll be able to really measure the learning progress of the students. Next is that it evaluates student learning at the end, as I've said, at the end of an instructional unit, by comparing it against some standard or benchmark. That's why you really have to set your criterion or success performance, so that you would, at the end of the chapter, lesson chapters, at the end of the instructional unit, you would be able to see that, oh, my students really performed well after this instructional delivery. Yeah, my students have excelled in the class right after my teaching. So that's the essence of doing the summative assessment, because we'll be able to measure the progress as a whole of the students, okay, after the instructional delivery against a specific standard or benchmark. And then also, it may be in the form of an end of term exam. If in the formative assessment, it may be in the form of quick question or informal questions, maybe in the form of practice exercises, a low stake quiz, and other learning tasks, okay, just to monitor the students' performance. In this scenario, summative assessment may be in the form of end of term exam, which of course includes several lessons, not only one lesson, but several topics in a particular chapter or unit. And then it may be also in the form of cumulative work over an extended period, such as final project. It can also be considered, okay, when you are doing the summative assessment, because that's a compilation of the learning works of the students, because it says here it's over an extended period. It's not just one-time activity, but this is a compilation of the activities of the students. So such as they would be able to come up with a certain final project and end of unit or chapter test. Okay, so this may be considered as some of the forms in providing summative assessment. Let's move on with the methods of assessment. So we're done discussing the types of assessment which may take the form of formative or assessment. Of course, when you consider formative and summative, you really have to consider the objective of doing the assessment, okay? Because that would really determine whether you will provide formative or summative. If your intention, for example, is just to monitor the progress of the students all throughout the learning processes during the instructional delivery, then you go for the formative assessment. But if your intention, for example, is to see the overall performance and to see the learning progress of your students, then you go for the summative assessment. Now, this time, we'll be moving on to the methods of assessment. Now, let's speak first traditional assessment. So, what do you mean by a traditional assessment? So from the word itself, meaning to say this is about a conventional method of assessing student learning. And this is usually using a standardized or paper and pencil test. Okay. The use of traditional assessment is very common in every classroom because this is the common type of measuring the level of progress of the students, the level of learning of the students after a certain instructional delivery. For example, I give you a lesson about the assessment. Then let me see if you really understood the topic. Then I'm going to give you an examination. I'm going to give you a paper and pencil test. There are also cases that the teachers would use standardized tests just to come up with a valid and reliable results of the performance of the students. And these kind of assessment tools are under the method of traditional or conventional method of assessing student learning. And of course, this is used to evaluate if the students have learned the content and to determine whether or not the students are successful in acquiring knowledge. So the very essence of providing traditional assessment, this method of assessment, is just really to check whether the students really understood the content of the lesson. Now, the primary reason of doing traditional assessment or giving the students standardized or paper and pencil test is just to see or measure whether the students really learn the content of the lesson. It's more of the content of the lesson, okay? And to determine if they're really not successful in obtaining that knowledge about the content of the lesson presented by the teacher. Okay, now what about authentic assessment? Authentic assessment is the newest method that we really have to consider nowadays in doing the assessment, not just traditional. Although I'm not telling you that authentic assessment is more important than traditional, but of course, both of them are important. You really just have to consider the weight of providing this kind of method depending on the objective of the assessment. If your intention, for example, is to evaluate whether the students understood better the content, you go for the traditional assessment. But if you're looking, for example, on how the students apply the content, the knowledge on the content that they have obtained from the instructional delivery, or you mean that you would really like to see whether the students would be able to perform, apply that knowledge, the acquired knowledge that they have from the content in real life situation. So now you go for the authentic assessment because it says here that authentic assessment is a performance assessment. This is also known as the alternative assessment and a direct assessment. Direct assessment because from there, when you ask your students, all right, present in the class what you have learned today through this kind of activity. For example, now directly you can see, you can measure, you can really examine how well the students perform in your class, how well the students get that pertinent information out of the content that you have presented. So that's why it's also known as direct assessment. Okay, and the next is it is used to measure students' proficiency by asking them to perform real-life tasks. All right, so after, for example, a certain topic, you have presented the content of the lesson, and these are the concepts that you have to consider, for example, while you are delivering the lesson to your students. Then you ask your students, all right, now this time it's your turn, you present it using this kind of learning task. The purpose of doing the authentic assessment is really to determine the proficiency of the students, to apply that knowledge that they have obtained from the content in real life scenario. Okay, and to provide also the students many avenues to learn and demonstrate best what they have learned. We are going to consider authentic assessment when we would like really to see whether the students are ready to perform it in real life situation. And of course, if you would like to give more opportunities to students to demonstrate that particular knowledge in real life scenario or in a particular learning activity, then you go for the authentic assessment and you provide this kind of method in assessing the student performance. Now, let's compare it, okay, for us to be able to understand better the difference between traditional and authentic. Okay, so as we all know, when we going back to the previous slides, traditional pertains to the provision of standardized and paper and pencil tests, while for authentic assessment, it's more on asking the students to perform the knowledge that they have acquired from the content being presented to them. So it means to say that it's about the provision of performance tasks or learning tasks, demonstration of a specific learning. Okay, now let's take it one by one. So first is on the traditional. Okay, so it says here it provides teachers a snapshot of what the students know. Okay, a snapshot, meaning to say it's not really the totality of what the students know. It's just a parcel of what the students know when you provide a traditional assessment. Okay, and it's about what students know, meaning to say it pertains to the knowledge of the students. Then for authentic, so it provides teachers a more complete picture, okay, of what the students know. Okay, it pertains on the knowledge of the students and what they can do with what they know. That's very, very beautiful for authentic assessment, because authentic assessment is not just concerning on what the students know, but also this kind of assessment is also concerned on what the students can do with what they know. And that's very important, and that's really the essence of why we are educating the learners, for them to be prepared in the real world. By just learning the content of the lesson, that's not enough for the students to be inside the classroom, just learn the content without applying it. So application is really, really important part of learning inside the classroom. That's why authentic assessment is also an important method of assessment. Okay, then for traditional, so this is rigid and fixed because this is standardized. This is a paper and pencil test. So rigid, meaning to say whatever is indicated in the paper and pencil test, the students would just have to answer what are required in the test. Okay, and then for example, you ask them compute for this particular mathematical equation, then there is a specific answer for that. Okay, a very concrete answer. The students have no opportunity to go beyond what is asked, because this is a test, this is a rigid and a standardized test provided to students when using traditional assessment. But for authentic, this is flexible, okay? And it provides multiple acceptable ways of constructing products or performance. It promotes flexibility among your students. It gives your students opportunity to become more creative in the production of learning outcomes, unlike in the traditional assessment, which is they are just focused on the answers provided on the test. So as I've said, so traditional, this is standardized. The responses that you can obtain from the students are fixed. On the other hand, for authentic assessment, it needs well-defined criteria or rubrics and standards to achieve reliability and validity. For example, you ask your students to perform a certain learning task. Then that would be very difficult for the teachers to assess the performance of the students when criteria or rubrics are not present. That's why an authentic assessment should have prepared or should have a well-defined criteria or rubric, so that it would serve as the guide of the teacher in rating the performance of the students. So unlike for traditional, because that's standardized, because once the students got the correct answer, then the students would be able to obtain the correct mark or rating. But for the authentic assessments, this is flexible. There are variety of presentation or demonstration of learning coming from the students. Then criteria or rubric should be set, okay, in the use of authentic assessment. Okay, next is that assessment is separated from teaching and learning. That is for traditional. As I have told you, this is just through the use of standardized and paper and pencil tests. And when you provide it, that's separated from the instructional delivery. So you just have to provide, for example, an exam to your student after the the delivery of a certain lesson or topic. Okay, but for the authentic assessment, assessment is integrated with instruction, because from time to time you can ask your student, for example, you ask them to perform this during the instructional delivery, and that would be easy for the teacher to assess the performance of the students. Okay, according to this, so traditional, easy to score because they are just paper and pencil tests. Well, you just have to check whether the students got the correct answer or not. And then teachers can evaluate students more quickly and easily. Okay, that's correct. But for the authentic assessment, that is harder to evaluate, because sometimes there are cases that the teachers would become more subjective in doing the assessment, because it depends on the perspective of the teachers. It depends on the standards of the teachers sometimes. Okay, that is why a well-defined and a well-crafted criteria or rubric should be set, okay, prior to the provision of performance tests, which is one of the examples of authentic assessment. Okay, and then also for traditional, however, it is less time and easier to prepare. That's correct. Easy to administer. Okay, because you only have to prepare the exam, for example, or the test, and then you just have to administer the test to your students, and that's it. But for authentic assessment, this is time consuming, because you really have to look into the details of providing the student perfect learning activities to suit the different styles of learning of the students. You really have to work on the detailed and relevant criteria and rubrics. Okay, you really have to set it clearly so that you will be able to come up with a reliable and valid results. Okay, then this is sometimes time and effort spent exceed, okay, the benefits. So that's why authentic assessment is quite demanding on the part of the teacher. It's quite tasky and time consuming on the part of the teachers, while they want to really see the performance of the students using this method of assessment. For the traditional, this is objective, because assessment is coming from a standardized test or exam. This is reliable and valid, okay? Then for authentic, this is susceptible to unfairness, subjectivity, lacking objectivity, reliability, and validity if not properly guided by well-defined or clear criteria or rubrics and standards. That's why this is really a challenge to all teachers in the classroom. To all teachers who would like to assess the performance of their students using authentic assessment, to really devise and be careful in crafting criteria, rubrics, and standards to avoid being unfair in rating the performance of the students, because sometimes the subjectivity of the teacher is there when they are assessing the performance of the students. That's why it's really a call to all teachers when you are providing authentic assessment to set well-defined, well-crafted criteria. And of course, the teachers may ask the expertise of other people, okay, so that the teachers will really ensure the validity and reliability of the content of the criteria to be used when they are going to apply authentic assessment. Last time, these are few examples of traditional and authentic assessments that commonly used by teachers inside the classroom. For traditional, maybe a true or false test, okay, that we have the multiple choice test, and then maybe in the form of standardized test, achievement test, okay, we also have the intelligence test and the aptitude test. For authentic assessment, okay, it may be in the form of demonstrations, hands-on experiments, okay, computer simulations. As you can see, there are more of performance tasks, portfolios, of course, okay, projects, multimedia presentations, role plays, recitals, stage plays, and exhibits. So these are few examples of traditional authentic assessment tools that the teachers may consider in providing these two types of assessment. So both of them are important. So as I've said a while ago, it depends on the objective of the teacher. It depends on the learning objectives. It depends on the targets of the teachers. Why or what are they going to assess? So if you go for the knowledge or the content of the lesson, if they are really mastered by your students, then you go for the traditional. But if you would like to really see if this knowledge acquired by your students can be applied in real life context, in a particular activity or scenario, then you go for the authentic assessment. I hope this presentation would give you further reference or guidance in determining the progress of your students. And of course, for my references that you may also consider in your future studies and your future presentations and application of the topic that I have presented to you. So these are my sources or the content that I have shared to you. Thank you very much for listening.